Kenya warns the UN, close down the world's largest refugee camp or we'll do it ourselves. It follows an attack on a Kenyan university by Al-Shabab. But should Somali refugees pay the price for Kenya's war against the armed group? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly. Kenya has responded to an attack by Al-Shabab fighters that killed 148 people with an ultimatum to the United Nations. It's calling on the UN to close its sprawling Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya and relocate 500,000 refugees to Somalia. Kenya accuses Al-Shabab fighters of hiding in the camp and using it as a base for attacks such as the assault on Garissa University earlier this month. Deputy President William Ruto says the UN has 3 months to make alternative arrangements or Kenya would, quote, relocate them ourselves. In a statement from his office, Ruto also said the way America changed after 9/11 is the way Kenya will change after Garissa. And he added, we must secure this country at whatever cost. Well, the Dadaab refugee camp is considered the largest in the world. It was set up in 1991 to house refugees fleeing from civil war in Somalia. The vast camp in northeastern Kenya is home to more than 500,000 people. In 2013, Kenya, Somalia and the UN agreed to voluntarily repatriate some of Dadaab's refugees back to Somalia. Around 100,000 have since returned. Now, Kenya wants the remaining refugees sent back to a designated area in Somalia within 3 months. To our discussion in just a moment after we hear from Al Jazeera's correspondent Mohammed Ado, who's at the Dadaab camp about 100 kilometers from the Kenya-Somali border.
Tension is high in the refugee camps of Dadaab, home to up to 500,000 people, most of them from Somalia. People here are now uncertain about their continued presence in these camps after Kenya called on the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to relocate these refugees back to Somalia within 3 months. Now, people here who we've been speaking to, and particularly the elders, are telling us that they are disappointed with the calls of the Kenyan government for their relocation. They say that they have not been taking part in the spate of insecurity in the country, and they also point out that there is absolutely no assurance that with their departure from Kenya will come security for Kenyans. They're also pointing out to the fact that they have lived here for the past 25 years. The children who were born here now have their own children born also in the camps, and that they used to live here and would not be able to get security back in Somalia. The refugees are also pointing out that they come from different parts of Somalia, and with clan protection being vital in Somalia, they say they would not be comfortable with being relocated to just one place in Somalia where some of them would not have their clans living in the vicinity. We've also been speaking to UN officials who tell us that it's not the responsibility of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to relocate these refugees back to Somalia. They're saying it's Kenya that voluntarily agreed to host these refugees, and for the past 25 years, and it's time it discussed the relocation of the refugees with its counterpart in Mogadishu. So far, the Kenyan government continues to ask for the relocation of these refugees, and it remains to be seen, although some UN officials are saying that it will be impossible to close the camp within the time frame given by the Kenyan government. Mohammed Ado for Inside Story in the refugee camps in Kenya.
Well, let's bring in our first guest. Macharia Munene is Professor of History and International Relations at the United States International University in Nairobi, and he joins us on the line from the Kenyan capital. Mr. Munene, thank you for being on Inside Story. First of all, can you explain to us why the Kenyan government thinks that closing Dadaab will improve the security situation in your country?
One, it will lessen the amount of perceived threats, given that some of the refugees have been associated with the protection of the attacks that have been increased on the civilians in Kenya. Some of them reportedly associated with the refugees. So the feeling is that Kenya has been good host to people who are in need, and some of them are turned against their hosts. So they are to lessen the threats to Kenya's national security and well-being. Maybe the feeling is that they should be able to go back home. Besides, the Somali state has increasingly been stabilized. They are safe havens, there are areas that people can go, and the United Nations can help to relocate them within the Somali state, which is then a way of going back home. But the feeling in the country is that the refugees are a threat.
So are you saying that the majority of Kenyans, Mr. Munene, approve this decision by the government despite it being a violation of international law?
I don't think it's a violation of international law because the Kenyans feel that the world has been released in terms of coming to the assistance of Kenya when it is in need. And this is a matter for discussion across the globe. That's the feeling that many of Kenyans have, that it should be raised and then see how well it can be tackled.
Okay, but don't you believe, Mr. Munene, that it is a bit of a disproportionate response? I mean, are all Somali refugees a security risk to Kenya today? Isn't it collective punishment to order the closure of Dadaab when even you've said that only some of these refugees pose a threat to Kenya?
Well, there is a difference to that, the security threat. There is a disproportionate burden on Kenya in terms of hosting these people, because there should be a collective responsibility and not just a Kenyan responsibility. And what has happened is that Kenya has been overburdened by the refugees who are an international responsibility, and then they end up being on, and Kenya has very little resources to share it around. So it's also an economic issue, it's a social issue, it's a security issue, and to some extent it's an international political issue. And all this combined make people feel now maybe the world should look into this matter afresh. And once it looks into the matter afresh, then it might come to a consensus. But the strong feeling is that with the recent attacks, recent killings, people are wondering whether it is the fact that Kenya is very generous in hosting people in need that is now hitting back instead of the appreciating the generosity of the country. Yeah. So there is a feeling that maybe other countries should also take responsibility.
But isn't there a danger here in stigmatizing Somali refugees and also Kenyans of Somali origin? Because it seems that every time an attack happens in Kenya, Somalis are targeted, people of Somali origin are targeted, whether it's in Nairobi, Garissa or Mombasa. Isn't there a danger also here?
Well, there's a distinction being made. Kenyans of Somali background are not the ones who have to be repatriated. They have nowhere to be repatriated. They are Kenyans. They stay in Kenya. Now, if somebody commits a crime, irrespective of whether he is of Somali or some other or background, he is dealt with accordingly. Now, should it be that some of the refugees are to be found in particular areas where they may be conducting some illegalities, then they'll be dealt with that way. But it is not targeting the Somali people, Kenyans. No, it is the feeling that has come is that these refugees who are said to come with weapons, who are said to be cooking up some strange things, and even radicalizing some people, training. Those are the concerns that are coming up.
I know there are a lot of concerns, but just a final question for you, Mr. Munene. Do you sincerely believe that closing Dadaab and building a 700-kilometer wall along the Somali-Kenya border, as Deputy Prime Minister Ruto has suggested, is going to solve the issue, is going to improve Kenya's security?
Well, it's going to be a difficult thing. Of course, both suggestions are basically difficult, but it gets people thinking and talking of what it is that needs to be done. What eventually will be done is a matter to be decided, but people should start talking about these security concerns. If sending some refugees back to wherever they came from is one way, that will be attempted. If building a wall to separate them, and it's not just a wall, but it has to be a properly thought security perimeter that can be monitored and at least ensure that security is assured to the Kenyans. It is odd, as I said in some other place, but it is something worth thinking about.
Okay, Macharia Munene, thank you very much indeed for sharing your viewpoint with us. Thanks for your time. Macharia Munene was joining us there on the line from Nairobi. Well, let's now introduce our other guests. With me here in the studio is Afyare Elmi, Somali Affairs Analyst and Professor of International Affairs at Qatar University. And in Geneva, we have Gerry Simpson, Senior Researcher and Advocate of the Refugee Program for Human Rights Watch. Welcome to you both. Gerry, if I can start with you, what is your reaction first to the Kenyan government's decision, its announcement, and is it at all possible to relocate 500,000 people in 90 days?
Well, it's not entirely surprising. There's been a lot of hot air blown in the past whenever there have been attacks, vitriol against Somali refugees, and in fact, police attacks against Somali refugees and Kenyan Somalis. So this isn't the first time we're facing this kind of situation. It is the first time, though, that there's been an announcement suggesting that in fact, about 425,000 registered Somali refugees in Dadaab, but also in the Kakuma camp and in Nairobi, face repatriation. It is logistically impossible for Kenya to remove that number of people in 90 days. With all the buses in the world and all the goodwill in the world, that would be impossible. I don't think, though, the issue is whether or not this is logistically possible. I think the issue is whether this is makes sense and whether it's lawful. And on both counts, this idea completely fails.
But as we've heard from our guests from Kenya previously, just a while ago, Kenya today finds itself in an emergency situation. Many of these Somali refugees have stayed in the country for more than 20 years, and there are today many places in Somalia that are safe for repatriation. Afyare Elmi here in Doha, is it inconceivable for them to return today to Somalia?
Well, first of all, I think Kenya has a right to just try to improve the security within the country, but the decision of sending about 500,000 people back to Somalia within 90 days, I agree, is not practical. And not only that, it is not right to do that, not only against the conventions, but it does not even advance the peace that the Kenya is trying to get. Simply because, A, it collectively punishes the entire community and criminalizes that whole community by just saying that the insecurity is because of Somalis. And Somalis, by the way, are not only those that are from Somalia, but they are also Kenyan citizens. So this is, I think, not right and not legal from the international. And not only that, in general, I mean, whether it's morally or policy-wise, it is not a good policy to just target an entire community. The whole idea here is just, I mean, to get a security that is based on laws. And if the government is just outside that bound, I don't think that's going to serve anybody's purpose at all.
Well, the UN's refugee agency, UNHCR, said on Sunday it had not received the Kenyan government's request. The spokesman, Emmanuel Nabera, said, "We have not received any formal communication on or formal requests from the Kenyan government along this line." And he went on to say that Kenya has an international obligation to protect the refugees, and that includes no forceful repatriation to the country of origin. Gerry, in Geneva, tell us about some of your concerns as far as moving such a vast number of people in such a short period.
Well, I think the main point to raise here is since the mid-90s, there have been a number of attacks by unknown people in Kenya, sometimes unknown, mostly unknown. Not in a single case has Kenya identified a Somali national or a Somali refugee as responsible for any of those attacks. What would be impressive is if effective Kenyan policing could identify the people responsible for the type of horrendous attacks that we saw in Garissa recently. Kenya has failed to do that. It is, as a result, instead of admitting that there are policing failures and that it's not doing its job to find the people responsible for these heinous acts, it is ripping up refugee law by proposing to repatriate registered refugees. International law is very clear. Registered refugees and registered asylum seekers may not be sent back to the place that they fear harm. There are exceptions to that. There are two exceptions. One is you can exclude an individual refugee from refugee status if they have committed and have been shown to have committed certain acts, quite specifically defined as, for example, crimes against humanity or acts contrary to the United Nations principles and conventions. And the second scenario is where a state like Kenya decides that the country of origin, in this case Somalia, is safe. And so in this case 425,000 refugees, could be stripped overnight under the so-called cessation clauses of the Refugee Convention. But there are procedures to follow to do that. And the most important point is that there is, of course, no peace in Somalia. There is still widespread insecurity. The UN Refugee Agency issued updated guidelines in June last year, making clear that vast swathes of south central Somalia, where these people come from, are still subject under the control of Al-Shabab and non-state armed actors.
Jerry, so let me ask you this, because you've been to Dadaab. Sorry to interrupt you. You've been to Dadaab, Jerry. Is there legitimacy to the idea put forward by the Kenyan government that some elements of Al-Shabab, of the armed group, are hiding, in fact, within the refugee camp?
Well, there are a large number of Kenyan police and other security forces in the camps. Some of them have come under attack in recent years, and a lot of those men and women do very brave work policing those camps. However, there is no evidence that any of the people that have been confined to those camps, and they are confined there is no right to free movement out of those camps, are responsible for the Garissa attacks or any other attacks. And it is the Kenyan government's responsibility to show who amongst this vast refugee population may or may not be responsible, to investigate them, and if there's enough evidence, to prosecute them. 75% of the population of Dadaab, which is 325,000 people strong, are women and children. We could assume maybe there are women and children amongst the attackers, but let's start with that basic statistic. Of course, men, the vast majority of men, and maybe all of them in Dadaab, are also innocent of any alleged crimes. But it's the Kenyan government's obligation to find these people and not to rip up refugee law and collectively deport these refugees.
Well, let's take a closer look now at Kenya's involvement in Somalia over the years, because Al-Shabab has said it's attacking Kenya because of its involvement in Somalia. Kenya launched an operation inside Somalia in 2011 after a number of attacks on tourist destinations in northern Kenya. Now, quickly signing up to an existing coalition known as AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia. But Al-Shabab has carried out dozens of attacks in retaliation. Most notably, the armed group killed 67 people in a siege of Nairobi's Westgate Mall back in 2013. And as we've been mentioning, 148 people were killed in an Al-Shabab attack on a university in Garissa earlier this month. Afyare Elmi, Al-Shabab has said it's striking Kenya because of Kenya's involvement. If Kenya were to decide to pull out of the AMISOM mission today, would that change things, do you think? Would that improve the security of Kenya?
That's at least the argument that Al-Shabab is using. But long before Al-Shabab claimed this, I was of the opinion that both neighbors, Ethiopia and Kenya, should not be involved in the AMISOM. If there is any need for peacekeeping, it should come from outside the region. Those countries that do not have, vested interest in the political and the economic issues that within the Horn of Africa. That was also, supported by the UN Security Resolution a while ago. But when it comes to this, I think overall one can question the wisdom of sending Kenyan troops to Somalia and getting involved, while they already had a policy that worked for them for quite a while during the Moi era, that they never intervened in the region or the neighbors' issues. I think Kenya was basically I would say misled to just intervene militarily to a quagmire that exists within the region. But more importantly, it is just making another mistake by collectively punishing Somalis by like 80 hawalas, closing just last week, and then now saying that the entire refugee is responsible. I think the government is externalizing its shortcoming by just targeting the victims that themselves. By the way, we have to remember that just a week ago, Al-Shabab attacked a hotel in Mogadishu and killed more than 40 people that were just civilians. Somalis were suffering already because of the violence of the Al-Shabab. I think sending just the other side of the border will not change anything. Even if they just send it the other side, it's controlled by Al-Shabab. So what's going to happen? Right. I think Kenya needs to look back its security strategy and re-evaluate what needs to happen. confining Al-Shabab to Somalia itself is not comprehensive enough to understand the security challenge here.
Gerry, there are those, as our Kenyan guests that we had on earlier, who say this is not just a security issue, but a societal issue as well, having such a large number of Somali refugees in the country, some of whom have stayed for more than 20 years. You know, how do you address that, the societal challenges? What do you tell the majority of Kenyans today who are simply fed up with seeing so many refugees in their country?
No, I think there are two points to make there. First of all, yes, Kenya has been on some levels a generous host since 1990. However, it is important to remember that from the very beginning, Kenya enacted an encampment policy, confining hundreds of thousands of Somalis to the Dadaab camps. That means that the burden has actually fallen on Garissa, the town nearby, and the surrounding communities up 90 kilometers north of the town of Garissa, up in northeastern province. That province has historically been neglected by the central authorities, and it is mostly populated by ethnic Somalis who are Kenyan citizens. What instead of investing in that area and helping the area cope with the influx over the years, the authorities have continued to ignore that area. Agencies have been trying to encourage the authorities to do more to support the communities surrounding the camps, but they've largely not succeeded because there hasn't been enough buy-in from the central authorities. So that's important to remember. I think the second thing to remember is that the refugees that are in Nairobi, and we're talking now about 32,000, they've been around 40,000 registered refugees, but also tens of thousands more who are unregistered, have been an important part of the thriving part of Nairobi's economy, which is in the suburb of Eastleigh. That is possibly, from what I've understood, East Africa's largest trading center, and it brings in hundreds of millions of shillings a year. So the idea that Kenyans have been a massive burden and an economic suck on the country doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
So would you say that then Kenya stands to lose by repatriating such a large number of refugees?
There is no question that financially the Nairobi-based economy will suffer if large numbers are forced out of the country, including the unregistered Somali refugee population, of whom, as I say, there are probably tens of thousands and some estimate hundreds of thousands. It's not clear whether this policy will target just the Dadaab camps or also Somali refugees in the cities.
Okay. Afyare, what about the Somali government in all this? I mean, there is now a government in place in Somalia. There have been elections. What is it doing to ensure the safety of its citizens that live across the border?
Well, this is unfortunate. I think Somali government has it's nowhere to be seen at all. It hasn't even commented while a number of its people are facing this problem. And I was in Geneva for this issue a while ago, and I remember that the discussion was that it's not even in the priority list of the Somali government. I think the Somali government has come short of what it was expected, and I cannot justify. I don't even know how they can just come in front of the people and say anything at this time and this late. When it comes to the issue of whether Somalis are more or less, burden on the Kenyans, well, you have to remember that all the UN agencies are also in Nairobi, and they benefit from, there are thousands and thousands of Kenyans that work in this area. So I think the whole idea has to be revisited. I agree that Kenyans, or particularly the Kenyan government, must do something about the security, but the way it's going about is wrong. I think that has to be underlined. And one thing that I have to just emphasize is that seeing Somalia or Somalis basically as something that's outside Kenya is wrong. There are millions of Somalis Kenyans that are of Somali origin that are also victims of what is happening at the moment. And I think we need to pay attention. Reckless, reaction would criminalize those, communities by basically, enticing some form of xenophobic attacks. And I think the politicians need to be careful in this business of just criminalizing or overreacting by just, painting the whole Somalis as criminals. I think this cannot be justified, and the government needs to come up with a cautioned approach in this issue.
Okay, we'll leave it on that note. Thank you very much indeed. Gerry, we have to leave leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Gerry Simpson from Human Rights Watch joining us there from Geneva, and Afyare Elmi from Qatar University here in Doha with us. And thank you for joining us for another edition of Inside Story. You can get in touch with us. Go straight to our program page at aljazeera.com. Post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly and the whole team, bye for now.